Welcome to Aaron Mahnke's Cabinet of Curiosities, a production of iHeartRadio and Grim and Mild.
Our world is full of the unexplainable. And if history is an open book, all of these amazing tales are right there on display, just waiting for us to explore. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosities.
It's hard to comprehend what we see sometimes. What might seem like something strange or otherworldly could be nothing more than a trick of the light or a clear and obvious hoax. For example, that famous 1934 photograph of the Loch Ness Monster, it's nothing but a picture of a children's toy cast in shadow. And all over social media, a computer-stabilized version of the infamous Bigfoot footage has been circulating, except it doesn't look like a mythical creature traipsing through the forest anymore. It looks like a guy in a costume. But for a pair of Ohio police officers, what they saw one early morning in April of 1966 was not a hoax. And it wasn't their eyes playing tricks on them either. It was real, and it ruined their lives. It was around 5 a.m. when Deputy Dale Spower and Wilbur Barney Neff noticed something odd on the side of Route 224. It was a car, seemingly abandoned. Spower got out to investigate, his flashlights illuminating his path. Except once he got to the car, all he saw were piles of walkie-talkies and radios inside, as though the owner had been hoarding them. This was a strange enough sight on its own, but then Spower pointed his flashlight a little lower, and that's when he saw the markings on the side. Someone had painted the words 7 Steps to Hell, along with a picture of a lightning bolt inside a triangle. This could have ballooned into something interesting, a true mystery for these two officers to solve. But then Spower heard the buzzing. It was a distant hum that he couldn't ignore. Suddenly, from behind a cluster of trees, rose an enormous silver object. It flew high into the air before bathing the surrounding area in a blinding light. He radioed in and informed his dispatcher about the UFO floating overhead, and then it took off. Spower and Neff were told to go after it. Their car hit 100 miles per hour as they craned their necks to keep the object in their sights. According to an article in The Times, Spower later described it as, and I quote, like the head of a flashlight, about 40 feet wide and 20 feet tall. Another officer named H. Wayne Houston had been listening to the radio chatter, and he took to the pursuit as well. Meanwhile, Police Chief Gerald Buchert had also heard about the ensuing chase and decided to grab his camera from home and hopefully snap a photo of whatever it was. They watched as it zigged and zagged above them, clearly being operated by someone or something inside. But after a short time, the officers lost visual contact with the craft. They met up with it again in Conway, Pennsylvania. It just floated there in midair, like it was something that was waiting for them. Spower flagged down a local cop to ask for assistance, and the officer radioed for help. Finally, after a chase lasting almost an hour and a half, Spower, Neff, and Houston got word that United States Air Force jets were on the way. And that's when the UFO zoomed off, leaving everyone on the ground dumbfounded. It wasn't just the officers either. A few hundred people had also claimed to have seen something flying overhead. A major from the U.S. government soon arrived to take statements. He was in charge of a program called Project Blue Book, which was responsible for looking into possible UFO sightings. He quickly dismissed the officers' claims, alleging that all they had seen was a satellite, or maybe the planet Venus. He told them that there had been nothing up there that morning, and no jets had been sent to investigate either. As for Buchert's pictures, they weren't enough to convince the major of anything except the chief's poor photography skills. But even though everyone else eventually moved on and left the incident alone, Spower refused to stay silent. He spoke to newspapers and anyone else who would listen, and that destroyed his life. His wife left him, he quit the force, and he wound up homeless. As for the Pennsylvania cop who helped him, he had to rip out his phone line while Officer Houston moved to Seattle and started driving a bus. But one funny thing did come out of this incident. 2 months after the first sighting, Spower was cruising down I-80 when he looked up and saw the saucer once again. Except he'd been prepared. Not wanting to face any further ridicule or attention, he gave the object a code name, something he could speak over the radio without worry. So he named it Floyd. And so when he spotted the UFO this second time, he told the dispatcher, "Floyd's here with me." A short time later, it had flown off for good. As for the car with the lightning bolt on it, well, that lead dried up too. By the time the officers got back to the scene, it was already gone. History is marked with mistakes, some big and some small. Sometimes those small mistakes get swept under the rug, and we never realize how one tiny force set off a chain reaction. And I mean that metaphorically. Today's story isn't about chemistry, but it is about a chance event that took the scientific world by storm. In 1879, a French microbiologist named Charles prepared to go on holiday. He closed down his lab and locked the door behind him. Charles was going to be gone for weeks. He probably looked forward to some much-needed rest. He and his lab partner had been working diligently on their latest project. They were trying to cure cholera in chickens. The disease wiped out whole flocks, which took a significant toll on farmers and consumers alike. But at some point between turning the key to the lab door and putting his feet up in front of a fire, Charles panicked. He realized that he had forgotten to perform one final step in their experiment. His partner, Louis, had left for the holiday break before him, so Charles was supposed to inject some chickens with their experimental concoction. Then, when the men returned, they would see how the chickens were doing. And Charles didn't want to let his partner down. Louis was kind of a big deal. He'd already made huge strides in their field, and people from all over the world had heard about him. This project was just as paramount. It could change the course of French society and the world. So 1 month later, when Charles returned to the lab, he quickly injected the chickens with that concoction, which had been sitting out while the scientists were away. At some point, Louis returned, and Charles broke the news of his blunder. But Louis didn't seem upset with Charles. That's because Charles may have inadvertently cracked the code. Now, to understand how, we need to go back about 100 years. Smallpox ravaged the planet, and a practice known as variolation developed in parts of Asia and Africa to combat the disease. That involved taking a sample of one's personal smallpox sores and transferring it to a healthy person. Healers did this either with a needle or by drying and grinding up smallpox scabs for a healthy person to breathe in through their nose. As a result, the person who received the sample would come down with a mild case of smallpox, nowhere near as severe as the cases people contracted naturally. In 1716, enslaved people brought this knowledge to the American colonies, as it had long been practiced in West Africa. And in 1721, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu brought variolation back to Europe after learning about it in the Ottoman Empire. And finally, in 1796, English physician Dr. Edward Jenner brought a new form of variolation to the mainstream. Jenner had caught wind that rural communities used samples from cowpox sores to protect against smallpox. The idea that cowpox was similar to smallpox, but far less deadly. Jenner tested this idea on an 8-year-old boy. He exposed the kid to a small amount of cowpox. The boy came down with mild symptoms and eventually got better. Then Jenner exposed him to smallpox, and the boy didn't become sick. And this brings us back to Charles and Louis's lab in 1879. Louis was heavily inspired by Dr. Jenner. He believed that if there was protection against smallpox, there could be protection against any disease. This was the whole reason he took on the challenge of preventing the spread of chicken cholera. And it was also why he wasn't mad at Charles for forgetting to inject the chickens. Prior to this point, Louis had identified the bacteria that caused chicken cholera. He and Charles had been injecting those chickens with fresh cultures of the bacteria. Under this method, the chickens died from the disease. Louis thought back to Jenner and the cowpox. He decided to inject the chickens with the old cultures. This time, the chickens came down with a mild form of cholera, but they all survived. Then the men injected the chickens with fresh cultures, and they didn't get sick. Voila! The men had found a preventative measure against chicken cholera. This was the first time a live, attenuated vaccine was successfully administered in a lab. Louis and Charles went on to help develop a similar vaccine for anthrax. And these two vaccines are some of Louis's later recorded achievements. As I mentioned, Louis was already a big deal in the scientific world. He revolutionized medicine by developing germ theory, which states that many illnesses are caused by microorganisms that are invisible to the naked eye and can only be seen under a microscope. He'd also been credited with discovering that microscopic organisms cause the process of fermentation. This helped him disprove spontaneous generation and come up with a way to prevent bacteria growth in food. To this day, we call this process pasteurization. which is named for, you guessed it, Louis Pasteur. But our story doesn't end here. In 1878, about 10 years before he died, Pasteur told his son-in-law that he never wanted anyone to see his laboratory notebooks. His son-in-law agreed to never share them, but it seems like Louis's grandson didn't get the memo, or maybe he had other ideas. In 1964, the grandson donated those notebooks, of which there were 152, to the French National Library. Historians pored through them, and some came to the conclusion that Louis often took credit for others' work and was haphazard in his methodology. One thing is for sure, though, if Charles had remembered to vaccinate the chickens before he went on holiday, he and Louis may never have made a crucial discovery. So next time you forget to complete a task at work, don't be so hard on yourself. You never know how one small mistake can change the course of history.
I hope you've enjoyed today's guided tour of the Cabinet of Curiosities. Subscribe for free on Apple Podcasts or learn more about the show by visiting curiositiespodcast.com. This show was created by me, Aaron Mahnke, in partnership with How Stuff Works. I make another award-winning show called Lore, which is a podcast, book series, and television show, and you can learn all about it over at theworldoflore.com. And until next time, stay curious.